We are on the forefront of this battle with climate change. Many species are losing habitat all over the world.
Pollutants and toxins, agricultural runoff.
We're seeing more frequent and more extreme droughts.
It's a losing battle, but one that we need to continue to fight.
A call to action. Scientists across the country warn that the long-lasting effects of climate change are here.
The forecast is pretty grim.
It's like death by 1,000 cuts.
We're just kind of rolling with the punches, trying to survive.
But so are those working together to heal the planet.
It's a beautiful story of nature getting back in balance.
It's inspiring.
We all have a role to play.
A role to play in protecting nature across America and beyond.
We really need to step up.
We owe it to each one of these animals to give them a voice.
This is a collective effort. We all have to be a part of the solution.
Hello, I'm Philadelphia reporter Brandon Goldner. 1 million species are threatened with extinction, according to the United Nations. One of the reasons? Climate change. Now, as dire as it may sound, there are many people working together to protect our planet and those threatened species. In Maryland, Paul Gessler found volunteers who are working to protect birds at great risk of losing their breeding grounds.
The sun rises on a clear, calm day in Ocean City.
It's a beautiful day out.
Bird songs signal the eve of migration season. The springtime calm, though, meets its end at the South Point boat ramp in Berlin.
Okay, we're off and running.
18 rafts are wrestled from their nearby winter hibernation.
This will be, I believe, our 4th year.
Signs of last year's deployment crackle as floating rafts are dropped into the Sinappuxet Bay.
Deployment day is always important.
Dozens of volunteers ready for a day-long marine operation.
Mark, you got 10 minutes!
Kim Applenalp of Maryland Coastal Bays takes the lead on shore.
We thought it was going to work. We didn't know it was going to work as well as it did.
It is a series of rafts forming a 2,300 square foot island, 18 sections to form an island attraction for birds.
Artificial vegetation.
So this will be first raft.
It's a puzzle, and to an outsider, it looks complicated.
It's not. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 18.
The island is critical for several species. Built in 2021, a Hail Mary of sorts as a breeding lifeline to endangered water birds.
Everybody here is driven by the passion of seeing these birds come back every year. It's inspiring.
Many bird populations have plummeted. Erosion, sea level rise, and more frequent worsening storms all to blame.
We're talking like 90% declines in the last 20 years.
More like a 97% decline in common and royal terns. In 2003, officials tallied more than 1,000 nesting pairs here in the Maryland coastal bays, and by 2020 that number dwindled to just 35.
We've lost about 50% of our nesting islands in the last 30 years.
We've virtually driven them from their nesting grounds.
Land loss is clear at South Point Spoils Island, once home to many breeding habitats.
We've lost those 3 species, little blue, tricolored, and glossy ibis, all in the last 2 years. That's because of erosion of these islands.
Islands allow these birds to breed with less risk.
Because they nest underground in dense concentrations, any predator that gets in there is a problem.
Conservationists knew without action, the terns and their role in the ecosystem were in jeopardy.
It becomes this connected kind of collapse.
$108,000 later, they built the tern raft.
The investment for these birds, it's tiny on the grand scale, and they are so worth it.
Each of the 9 sections migrate slowly into place. At its spot in the bay, volunteers connect the rafts.
You can really see it coming together.
The return of the terns is now days away.
And they will come back year after year.
The dozens of pairs in 2020 have shot up in recent years.
332 nests. And the density could go up, so we're hopeful that the word's gonna get out.
Word got out. The results were so good, they doubled the size of the raft after the first year.
We have the technology and the wherewithal to build a long-term solution for these birds. It's just a question of finding the will to do it.
Officials tag and track many of the birds to study success in migration.
80% of the birds that we marked the year before are coming back to the raft.
Many species, not just birds, are losing habitat all over the world.
The long-term goal is to restore the breeding islands.
It would be nice if we just had islands that could do this for us, but in the meantime, we're doing this.
The rafts will be pulled in come fall once the season ends, but with disappearing islands, the need will remain.
We're on the forefront of this battle with climate change, and it's not happening 20 years from now. It is happening now.
In California, the state canceled salmon fishing for the second year in a row as those fish struggle to survive. Ashley Nanfria shows us what people are doing to rebuild their populations.
Romeo's Bait and Tackle has been a staple for Sacramento fishermen, including Ricky Acosta.
They have everything kind of hidden because there's no one coming in to buy salmon stuff.
Ricky, like many others, has not been able to reel in a salmon since the fall of 2022. His favorite spot along the banks has stayed quiet, and his business, Feeding Frenzy, is trying to stay afloat.
We're just kind of rolling with the punches, trying to survive.
Due to low salmon populations, officials have canceled salmon fishing in California for the last 2 years and will keep the season closed again this year, forcing Ricky and other fish guides to search for different options.
Without salmon season, we're forced to figure out new species to fish for, new areas that we're fishing at different times of the year.
We've seen losses of close to 90-95% of the eggs in the river because the water is just getting too warm.
NOAA Fisheries has had to put several salmon species on the endangered list, which puts a special protection on the fish and helps set up a national recovery plan to keep them from going extinct.
To compare to what we see today, they're just barely a shadow of what they used to be.
The Sacramento River, once full of salmon, now impacted by climate change, with warming waters and years of drought.
We're seeing more frequent and more extreme droughts over the past several decades. In the last 15 years or so.
2023 was the exception, with a record amount of rain and snow. Yet the salmon season was still canceled after severe drought from 2019 to 2022 impacted multiple spawning years.
We know that the more water flowing down the Sacramento River, the higher the survival of the juvenile fish making it to the ocean.
The warmer years have outpaced the cooler ones. Spring runoff in the Sacramento River has decreased by 8% in the past century.
Salmon thrive in cool, wet conditions. They like a lot of water in the river and they like cold water. And during droughts, we don't get that. We get the opposite.
The land, too, has changed with the addition of dams and the loss of valley floodplains. The ripple effects impacting those that rely on the fish.
They bring back 10 to 20 pounds of organic material, nitrogen and carbon, that they got in the ocean, and that's delivered into the rivers and streams.
Threatening ecosystems and the economy, as the California salmon industry is valued at $1.4 billion on average, providing 23,000 jobs annually.
With no salmon season, it's not only taken money out of the economy for the fishing boats, the bait shops, hotels, and gas stations.
Biologists say now is the turning point.
The clock is ticking because these salmon populations, the drought has really pushed them down sometimes to really alarmingly low levels, and we need to get that turned around immediately.
By removing 4 dams from Northern California to Oregon this year, increasing floodplains, and raising fish in captivity to release in the future.
It's almost like putting them into a museum so we know that they're going to be there in the future and that we can use those fish as the beginnings of rebuilding the population.
From the state level all the way down to local fish shops.
We're trying to do our part as fishermen and conservationists of the outdoors.
Everyone now lending a helping hand.
It would just be a tragic thing for California to lose these iconic fish.
Further to the south in California, climatologist Marina Jurica shows us how climate change impacts how whales migrate.
The majestic gray whale migrates more than 10,000 miles every year from the chilly feeding waters of the Arctic to the warm breeding grounds of Baja California. Human-caused climate change is now throwing a big curveball.
And then when you layer on fisheries entanglements and loud and noisy oceans and boat strikes, it's like death by 1,000 cuts.
And it's not just the ocean's largest creatures.
Over the past 15 years, we've had more unusual mortality events of a variety of whale species, seals and sea lions, small cetacean species, more than we've had ever in the past.
Climate change is altering ocean temperatures and currents, which is making it harder to find food. Gray whales are migrating later, malnourished, and sometimes giving birth in unprotected areas further north. With an increasing lack of prey in their usual hunting grounds, orcas, also known as killer whales, are showing up off the Southern California coastline, intersecting with gray whales and their calves with deadly results.
There's not a lot of things big enough to take down a gray whale, and orcas are one of them that have figured it out. So that's one of the most important things, is to study and understand how a warming ocean can impact the movements of animals.
Migration pattern changes in killer and gray whales are just the beginning.
Our environment is so connected, and the ecosystem really has these kind of butterfly effects where one little thing happens and that can really result in significant impacts down the road.
Oceans have absorbed about 90% of the Earth's increased heat energy over the last 50 years. In recent years, prolonged periods of unusually high ocean temperatures, known as marine heat waves, have occurred across the globe, creating devastating effects on the marine ecosystems. Think of a ripple that turns into a wave. Everything has a cause and effect. As a climatologist, I have to forecast and monitor these changes so that we can protect and preserve these vital ecosystems.
Time is of the essence as climate change reshapes the delicate equilibrium for all of us who live here.
Education is really the key for turning this around. This is a collective effort. We all have to be a part of the solution.
Like dominoes, it only takes one person to inspire change.
The key deer only live in one place in the entire world, the Florida Keys, but sea level rise is squeezing their habitat further inland. Meteorologist Dave Warren explores how fire could help save them.
We traveled to the largest island in the Lower Keys, Big Pine Key. What makes it unique is this. That's a key deer. They're only 2 to 3 feet tall. They've called Big Pine Key home for thousands of years. The problem? That home is shrinking.
Sea level rise is slowly encroaching and increasingly quickly encroaching on the habitat, making it smaller, and particularly reducing the availability of fresh water. You know, hundreds of years ago, this was all pine forest.
Chris Berg is the field program director at the Nature Conservancy. We met him here. From the ground, you can see the consequences of sea level rise. From the air, you see it's happening all over the island. This used to look like this.
This is a pine rockland. We've got palms and pines, a lot of wildflowers here. So the bugs really love it here, but especially our key deer.
That's wildlife biologist Christina Wilson.
So here in the Florida Keys, the key deer is that umbrella species that is helping all of these other animals that need this habitat as well. And key deer play a huge role in the Florida Keys. They're always eating something consistently. There's beautiful sea grapes out here, plums. There's things that I want to eat, but these key deer get to them before us, but they're spreading these seeds throughout, you know, the islands here.
But this habitat and those seedlings need fresh water to grow, something that has become harder to find as the seas squeeze the habitat farther inland, whether it's the slow rise of sea level due to climate change or more powerful storms pushing salt water farther inland.
If we can't stop sea level rise, the sea will continue to shrink the habitat. It'll move in, it'll turn the fresh water into salt water, and the deer won't have that vital element.
Turning pine rockland to this, leaving little left for the deer to eat or drink.
Basically, they won't have habitat, they'll become extinct.
Key Deer Boulevard, it's one of the main roads on Big Pine Key.
Working to slow or even stop that process is Kevin Kalis. He's the Coastal Program Coordinator for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. This is Key Deer Boulevard. It runs right down the middle of Big Pine Key.
What happened is, over time, we would have coastal storms that would push salt water into the marsh and wouldn't be able to get out.
That's a problem being solved by the work here.
Once we have this restoration fully functioning where we can manage the water, these are culverts that will allow water to escape, but we can also hold water.
Covering this area for the deer is one step. The other is controlled burns.
This is something that we actually did on purpose. We call them prescribed burns.
Fires were once a natural process here in the Keys. Now left unchecked, this area has become too overgrown. 2 years after the fire, the habitat is open, making easy access to their food now growing here.
It's things like this that we need to do, that the refuge needs to do to make space for the deer, to make habitat for the deer as seas are rising and taking away habitat on the fringes of the rocklands.
Open spaces like this that were overgrown now turned into new habitat. It's what the deer need. It's as everything shrinks, pushing them and the residents of Big Pine Key closer together. Those that live here do what they can to protect the deer today, but according to Chris Berg, they will have to do a lot more in the future.
The real root cause of this problem is people contributing to climate change. We all have a role to play in understanding our contributions, and governments at every level, from the United Nations right down to the city of Key West.
Doing what they can to protect the deer and preserve what habitat is left for tomorrow.
It's a losing battle, but one that we need to continue to fight.
I work in Philadelphia, and deep into the pinelands of New Jersey, climate change takes the form of a creepy, eerie presence called ghost forests. But the state has an action plan to help bring them back to life. Deep in the heart of Brendan T. Burns State Forest, where to some species, water is their lifeblood. But for these trees, it means death.
It does have an eerie presence, and it's kind of a foreboding, eerie existence of a ghost forest.
This large cluster of gray-colored Atlantic white cedar trees is a ghost forest. The reason why these trees are dead? Water.
It's really visually striking, isn't it?
Todd Wyckoff is the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's state forester.
This site, is a total loss in terms of the cedar trees that are here have died.
The DEP says back when Europeans first arrived in America, there were about 100,000 acres of Atlantic white cedars in New Jersey. Now there's only about 25,000 acres. The reason for that change? Climate change, which causes sea level rise. Carbon emissions from cars and factories are changing our climate by trapping in the heat and making the planet warmer. That melts glaciers and warms up oceans, causing water to rise.
Cedar is not particularly tolerant of salt water, so as you get sea level rise and saltwater intrusion into the groundwater, that really impacts cedar.
Supervising forester Bill Zipsey says climate change also causes more frequent storms. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy wiped out these Atlantic white cedars at Double Trouble State Park.
It looked like pickup sticks with lines of snow on top of them, and pretty much everything that we're standing in here had been blown down.
Thus began a real-life game of pickup sticks.
We bounced back and figured, well, we've got work to do.
By removing all these downed trees, it allowed the Atlantic white cedars still standing around the edges of the area to drop new seeds.
That's one of the cones, and the seeds are the size of pepper grains. So they're really, really tiny seeds. These cones open up and then get into the soil.
This is the result, a restored stand of Atlantic white cedars. DEP is now spending millions of dollars to restore 10,000 acres of Atlantic white cedars in 10 years. Well, why spend all this money? Because these Atlantic white cedars act as an effective filtration system for groundwater underneath the earth.
We lose too much of that part of our ecosystem, and we end up paying to build water treatment plants where the forest once was that was purifying our groundwater that we later drank.
A cost-saving method that could also save the planet. One of Atlantic white cedar's other benefits, it captures carbon responsible for warming the planet and fueling climate change. This ecosystem contains mature Atlantic white cedar trees.
It's a vibrant place full of life.
Wyckoff says the life and death of these Atlantic white cedars are a canary in a coal mine.
This to me is a signal, a call to action for all of us that climate change is here at our doorstep.
But Zipsy says we can change our actions.
So many of the climate change related messages right now are like, oh, we're doomed. It doesn't have to be that. There are ways to interact with an ecosystem where you can have a positive outcome.
By bringing Atlantic white cedars back from the brink of death to blunt the effects of climate change, and the big picture, keeping the ecosystem's heart beating. California sea otters were once hunted to near extinction, now protected. A growing body of evidence shows they may play a big role in fighting other impacts of climate change. Elizabeth Cook shows us how.
Early morning, a small boat takes off from Moss Landing, and our story begins.
It's a beautiful story of nature getting back in balance.
At the stern, community scientist and U.S. Navy vet Ron Eby. On board, marine scientists armed with binoculars and notepads.
He's right next to the bank.
Nearby, more community scientists, all volunteers, perched on the banks. They're set up at more than a dozen locations and ready to go.
We have an area that's been assigned to us, and it includes the marsh to this point, and then the slough.
Elkhorn Slough, one of the largest estuaries in California.
This area we call the wildlife viewing area.
They're set to view one of the most charismatic creatures on the planet, the southern sea otter.
The fur trade of the 1800s nearly wiped them out.
Prior to about 1995, there really weren't that many otters in Elkhorn Slough.
That all changed in the 80s when the Monterey Bay Aquarium released rescued otters into the slough. Now it's home to the greatest concentration of southern sea otters in the world. Thanks to the otters, another species, one that fights climate change, is once again thriving. It's called eelgrass.
When the otters came in, the eelgrass had grown significantly.
Here's why. The otters eat lots of crab. With fewer crabs to eat them, the number of sea slugs exploded. The slugs eat excess algae, crud, found on dying eelgrass, scrubbing it clean.
So they're taking that brown crud off the seagrass. The seagrass can then absorb light, and then it flourishes.
And that helps to tackle climate change. Lillian Carswell with U.S. Fish and Wildlife explains.
Seagrass absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it stores it in its root base, and its root base is buried in the marsh, and so that is a powerful form of carbon sequestration.
With the carbon stuck in the mud.
It doesn't get released back into the atmosphere and cause the global warming that's such a problem around the world.
Back to the binoculars and scopes.
One otter grooming.
The volunteers on land.
Oh, good.
And the scientists on the boat are monitoring the otters to record their activities, social behavior, and habitat use.
It's much more important to look now at their social dynamics, especially if we're going to translocate them.
The hope, if some of the otters are moved to other estuaries or bays in the state, that they may help to restore dying eelgrass there.
I'm looking forward to seeing more otter populations in the whole West Coast because they provide such a valuable role.
And that may benefit us all.
In the southwestern Pennsylvania waters, something called the hellbender, a type of salamander, once thrived, but these days they have dwindled to dangerously low numbers. Here's meteorologist Ray Petlin.
To look at the wide, flat, slimy face of a hellbender.
Some people think maybe they're not the most attractive little guys.
With its beady eyes and goofy grin.
How can you just not fall in love with that little face?
You might not think it's sending us a message, but the hellbender's absence from a river or stream in Pennsylvania is a warning sign that things are not right. Despite being the official state amphibian, hellbenders aren't exactly overflowing in our waterways these days.
We estimate there's only about 2,000 hellbenders left in the wild.
The largest salamander in the Americas, at anywhere from 12 to 29 inches, the eastern hellbender should live in rivers and streams throughout Pennsylvania and Appalachia. And if a hellbender can make it to adulthood, dodging fish, otters, and other hellbenders, the rest of the problems are caused by one thing: us.
Habitat destruction and degradation,
Pollutants and toxins, agricultural runoff,
fracking industry, and having that wastewater injected into the ground. Humans are the #1 predator.
The eastern hellbender's cousin, the Ozark hellbender, went through the same thing, but has been rescued from the brink thanks to more than a decade of conservation work.
We knew this animal was probably going extinct, and we had maybe a 10 to 12 year window to try to reverse that.
Missouri's chief herpetologist Jeff Brigler and scientists with the State Conservation Department have built a captive breeding program, collecting Ozark hellbender eggs in the wild to hatch and grow in the safety of the St. Louis Zoo.
And that resulted in a lot of little baby hellbenders to release in the future. And a couple of years ago, we reached our 10,000th hellbender released into the wild.
But that hasn't solved everything. There's still one more risk to hellbenders these days.
We had a 500 to 750 year flood event, and it devastated the habitat. We lost over half of our population of hellbenders.
Climate change means massive floods that were supposed to happen once a century or once a millennia are now becoming more common.
You're going to be having 100, 200 year floods every 20 years. And are they going to have time to rebound within those systems?
Brigler says breeding hellbenders to be released back into the wild needs to be paired with an active protection of their habitats, like planting trees along waterways to block runoff and to filter out toxins from homes and industries.
The more you can filter that, the more we can limit the damage to these systems.
Documenting hellbender sightings in our creeks and rivers isn't an arduous task.
So prehistoric.
It's something anyone who's out fishing can do. A hellbender just living there can give conservationists an idea of how things are improving in the whole environment. At this rate, it will take years of work for Pennsylvania's hellbenders to start to recover like their Ozark relatives. But at least for now, there's hope.
We owe it to each one of these animals to give them a voice.
The monarch butterfly used to be a sign of spring, but you aren't seeing as many anymore because of habitat loss and the impacts of climate change. But meteorologist Kylie Miller in Detroit looks at how researchers are hoping that by planting meadows of wildflowers, they will restore their population.
Monarch butterflies are well known, but have you noticed they're appearing less? Certain factors are contributing to this as the monarch population declines.
The shrinking population is alarming. Nearly 90% of the eastern monarch population has diminished. With their unique life cycle, monarchs are essential for our planet to thrive. Migrating from central Mexico, flying to the United States and parts of Canada, during their travels, butterflies lay eggs on milkweed, eventually creating a new generation that relocates farther north. The last generation won't reproduce and will fly back to Mexico for the winter. Along this migratory life process, monarchs are experiencing habitat loss, overuse of pesticides, disease, and a warming climate, all contributing to the drop in population.
That they're also experiencing threats related to climate change. So they need a very specific, temperature and precipitation conditions to develop from an egg all the way into a butterfly. And if those change at certain times of the years, they may not be able to quite survive as successfully or be able to reproduce as successfully.
Climate change not only impacts the butterfly survival, but also affects plants. The milkweed plant is known as the host plant for monarch butterflies.
So when you get warmer springs, wetter springs, all of this impacts how plants grow and when they grow, when they flower, the phenology of plants. And if there aren't a lot of resources for a butterfly at a certain time of year when they need them, when they're migrating, then that's going to impact the population.
Due to the vulnerability of the species, the monarch butterfly is a candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act. We will know more about this in December 2024. Conservation efforts are happening in many areas in hopes of restoring the population. Locally in Detroit, the Fish and Wildlife Program works with various groups.
So the city has taken a lot of parks that were underused and that were just lawn, and is converting those to wildflower meadows and to make corridors of habitat for pollinators, like monarch butterfly.
There are things that your average person can do, and that is plant milkweed, plant nectar plants in your yard if you can. You know, work with local community to make sure that they preserve, you know, existing habitat for monarch butterflies.
Despite their small size, monarchs play a critical role in our environment.
I'm meteorologist Kylie Miller.
Reporter Olivia Young looks at two native pollinators whose numbers are already declining and how researchers are petitioning for their protection.
Each year, researchers are seeing less of certain pollinators.
We used to have many more hummingbirds. I've been feeding hummingbirds here for 21 years now.
Arvind Punjabi still hasn't spotted a hummingbird in his Fort Collins yard. It's the latest he's ever waited for one.
Sadly, this one has not been used yet this spring, so I don't know if that's a sign of things to come here.
Punjabi monitors bird populations for the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. He's seen big changes in the state's hummingbird species.
The broad-tailed hummingbird has unfortunately been going through a long-term decline. It's lost nearly 50% of its population since 1970. On the other hand, the black-chinned hummingbird has been increasing over the last 50 years and moving north.
The black-chinned birds do well in desert environments, while broad-tailed hummingbirds are suited to cooler climates and higher elevations, and have seen a 30% population decline in the last decade alone. According to a 2019 Audubon Society report, broadtails are one of the birds most vulnerable to climate change in Colorado, with a projected 69% range loss if temperatures warm by 3 degrees Celsius.
One thing we could see is, their disappearance from the lower elevations. If things get hotter and drier down here, they'll be forced to move up.
It's a problem another Colorado pollinator is facing with even greater urgency.
Because bumblebees are adapted to those cool, high elevation environments, as the climate warms, there's only so much more up you can go.
CSU professor and bee researcher John Mola took part in a study on the health of native pollinating insects, commissioned by state lawmakers in 2022, which found that 1 in 5 Colorado bumblebee species are at risk.
In the next 50 years or so, we could see substantial declines in these species.
The researchers are now petitioning for those bees to receive protection under the Endangered Species Act. Mola says the western bumblebee in particular could be near extinction before the end of the century. But it's not just climate. Non-native pathogens, loss of habitat, and pesticides may be contributing to declines in population for both the birds and the bees. It begs the question, what would a Colorado without these pollinators look like? Experts say the ecosystem could be disrupted. So could Colorado's agriculture and tourism industries.
The prices of crops that rely on bumblebee population going up in price, or even becoming scarce or lower in nutritional quality.
It's why researchers want to take steps now to protect the pollinators who put the color in Colorado.
If you love wildflower displays in Colorado, then you really love that bee diversity that enables those beautiful displays.
It sure would be sad to lose such a charismatic bird that is so approachable and lives in such symbiosis with our people here in Colorado.
Scientists say we are losing birds at a rate we haven't seen since the extinction of dinosaurs. In Texas, there are efforts underway in one local city to keep the bird population soaring. Here's meteorologist Jeff Ray.
In the middle of Dallas County is 600 acres of green space, home to over 60 species of birds, including the orange-crowned warbler, a red-bellied woodpecker, the great horned owl. This is Cedar Ridge Preserve, one of the most visited nature areas in the state of Texas, managed by the Audubon Dallas Society. Their mission, to save bird populations. Every year, the group does a bird count over Christmas. The American crow population is up 47% since the 70s. The lark sparrow population is down 85%. Human encroachment is taking away their homes. Climate change is shrinking forests and reducing wetlands, sending a clear signal about diminishing resources for birds.
Birds truly are the canary in the coal mine. So birds are a wonderful indicator species for habitat health. And there's a phrase with Audubon is that where birds thrive, people prosper, because they're very sensitive to environmental change.
Jake Poinsettia at the Trinity River Audubon Center says birds play an important role in our ecosystem. They eat insects that destroy crops and spread seeds that lead to plants in new areas.
These plants are good for carbon sequestration from absorbing potential pollutants from the atmosphere. So loss of habitat can be a contributing factor to the impacts of climate change.
Cedar Hill Preserve sits inside the city boundaries of Cedar Hill, where the city's manager says they prioritize work to protect birds.
But we're very proud to be one of 10 in the whole state that has satisfied the requirements to be a certified bird city.
The designation recognizes the city effort to create a safe space for birds by protecting and enhancing habitats while raising awareness of the benefits of bird conservation.
They set on a goal to set aside an entire 25%, a quarter of the land area of the city, and dedicate it to open space.
This commitment to conservation continued as population growth exploded in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. While not every city has 600 acres of protected habitat for birds, there is a backyard approach that can help.
The second mass is a dual planting of Anisacanthus, which is hummingbird bush, and Texas sage.
For 3 decades, horticulturalist Chip Clint has run his landscape business. Now he applies his expertise to his own yard to help bring in birds.
What we can do is create an oasis within the city for birds, and I like to do something rather than nothing and bring in whatever I've learned that birds can utilize.
Staying with native plants, putting large groupings of shrubs to serve as habitat and safe zones, selecting plants that offer food for birds like blackberries, hollies, coneflowers. Yards like this, spread across the suburbs, can help replace what development and changing climate is destroying. Homeowners, cities, private groups, all trying to slow the loss of birds.
We are managing it for birds primarily, but we love our people who come out here because we know that they are the future protectors of this space.
And as future protectors, the fate of the bird species is largely in our hands.
Because of climate change, scientists say some Minnesota forests could disappear within the next 50 years. Reporter Aaron Hazanzadeh shows us how researchers are replanting to save forests on the brink.
Forests of the future
This is 2-year-old Norway pine.
are forged right here at Minnesota's Lone State Forest Nursery near Akeley.
We have about a 4 to 6 week window to get them out of the ground, packed, shipped out to the planting sites before they wake up.
It's go time.
That's right.
Like clockwork, it's time for the annual spring lift.
We're giving more, homes for wildlife. We're doing a lot for our communities also.
But this year, the stakes are higher and the philosophy is changing because scientists say Minnesota's North Woods are on the brink.
The pace of adaptation is too slow to keep up with climate change.
Julie Ederson's research at the University of Minnesota Duluth reveals the warming temps are stressing our forests.
We have been thinking about what we can do now to help our forests transition as climate changes around them.
And if that help doesn't happen now, she and other researchers say the deep, dark boreal forests we know in northern Minnesota could become mostly grasslands within the next 50 years.
The forecast is pretty grim. The boreal forest, no matter in any scenario, is gone. I've gone through the tears, I'm watching things die, and now I'm in the let's get it done.
Here at the state nursery, they plan to lift 2.5 million of these little trees this year, and they'll double it to 5, they're hoping, by next year. But to solve this problem, to create these forests of the future, experts say we really need all hands on deck.
grew up on the land, and I've been working it my whole life in one way or another.
Farmer Stefan Meyer is answering that call here in Willow River. He's part of a co-op of small growers selling trees to the Nature Conservancy, a nonprofit devoted to aggressively reforesting across the country.
These are the acorns. These are red oaks.
But experts say we don't just need more trees, we need the right ones. These seeds should produce climate-smart trees, a diverse set of species that should be hardy enough to withstand a warmer, wetter climate.
Trees do naturally migrate over time, but it takes centuries for them to do it on their own. What we're doing is we are trying to speed that up dramatically.
The idea, rooted in Ederson's research, is to collect seeds from an area and plant them roughly 150 miles north of where they came from. Call it human-assisted migration.
We are seeing things change very rapidly. So we need to be thinking like, okay, what's this tree going to be dealing with in about 20 years?
The state agrees. Because of that, the nursery is growing more hardwood trees, which are supposed to do better in our changing climate. But Tilma says we won't just need more growers, we need more people willing to plant on their property.
About 75% of the available open lands for tree planting is on private lands.
When demand grows, so will production, he says.
I think what's really important, though, is to anticipate changes in the climate and to make our forests more adapted to those changes by diversifying.
But some say it's a race against time, a race against rapid changes that could alter Minnesota's Northwoods forever.
This is a movement to get people engaged in this broader vision of reforesting our landscape.
I do think there is time for us to still take that action, but things are changing quickly and we need to step up. We really need to step up.
So I have a confession to make. Growing up in school, I hated science class. I just couldn't understand what was inside a microscope, all those indistinguishable blobs that would make up a cell. I wanted to get into journalism to get as far away from science as possible. Of course, that didn't end up happening. When I was in college and journalism school, I actually got assigned to do an investigation into sea level rise in the eastern shore of Maryland, and I actually enjoyed the experience and thought it was an interesting topic to cover. But it wasn't until 2021, when I was a television news reporter in Charlotte, North Carolina, that I began to fully realize the impact of environmental reporting. I was covering pollution at a paper mill in South Carolina, and it affected thousands of people from all different races and socioeconomic backgrounds. That was when I realized that pollution, climate change, the environment, it affects all of us, no matter our background. So when I got this opportunity in Philadelphia to really go in depth into climate reporting, I dived in head first because I know what it's like to get drowned by the jargon that we see in scientific papers. And I wanted to keep people afloat and aware that our climate is changing, but we have the power to do something about it, but also that there are people who did way better in science than we ever did, who are working to find solutions to address climate change. I'm Brandon Goldner. Thank you so much for watching.